Welcome to the 10-Minute Life Coaching Program, presented by me, Jay Cleveland Payne, one of the peak performance advisors from Fast Forward Business Properties. In the span of about 10 minutes, I'll present to you a show filled with a few ideas that I believe will help you improve your business and your personal lives. I'm also going to let you help me keep me on track by giving some details on some of the features and programs we have in production. In today's show, we're focusing on deadlines and priorities. Deadlines can be a serious source of stress, but they can also represent a great example of security and consistency, assuming they fall in line with what is truly priority one. We're going to try to help you come to love the concept of hitting your deadlines and give some tips to help you actually hit those deadlines. So let's start the clock and get to work. As I record the 39th episode of the 10-Minute Life Coach, I'm reminded that hitting deadlines has been a little iffy in the 9 or so months of producing this podcast. Parameters are a lot different from the podcast than with my day-to-day production duties I have in the quote-unquote real world of broadcasting. Because of the business, missing a deadline often means missing a source of income. It definitely means missing a piece of content that has to be filled with something, hopefully something more riveting than the dead air of silence or the almost non-existent video test pattern. Because this podcast is presented for free and you can listen to it at your own convenience, you might think that my sense of urgency isn't as high for the 10-Minute Life Coach as it is for my paid duties. But actually, that's not the case. The work on this podcast often takes a higher priority than some of my higher paying work. I also have missed more than a few deadlines when a paycheck was on the line, and not always for the best of reasons. Now, today's lesson is a lesson on handling deadlines mostly, but in order to really understand the importance of deadlines, we must first sneak in a small lesson on priorities. Starting with a definition of the word priority, meaning having the right to precede others in order, rank, or privilege, as in having precedence. A priority task is one that is higher in importance than the bulk of the other tasks you may be charged with completing. What makes that task a priority isn't necessarily that important. It could be the most profitable, it could be the most time-consuming, or the literal first task that has to be done to set the tone for an activity. Or it can mean a lot to someone who can make it worth your while to make it a priority. In the myriad of reasons to why a task could be deemed a priority, it is important to know that it doesn't necessarily make that task important to the process or particularly interesting or important to you as the person tasked to complete it. A definition of the word deadline is the time by which something must be finished or submitted. The sense of urgency doesn't come from the deadline itself, but from the consequences that may be levied if the deadline is not met. Because while the severity of a deadline like clean your room before dinner with the penalty of no dessert sounds pretty severe when you are 6 years old, it might not match up to the actual severity of missing deadlines like the April 15 tax submission or maybe surrendering yourself to authorities for a federal sentence. So without a real consequence, a deadline is just a suggestion as to when to complete a task. The greater the potential payoff or the worse the potential penalty is your main motivation for meeting your deadline. Add a priority ranking system to your list of duties, and your task rankings start to become a little more interesting. The distinction between what you should get done and what you need to get done gets a little muddied based upon the consequences of missing a deadline, who is putting a priority on it, and of course, your own personal motivation to actually do the work, which can easily run counter to the priority and the upcoming deadline with little to no rationale around it. Going back to the 10-Minute Life Coach and its priority in my life, while the podcast is being provided for free to you, its production consumes plenty of time and labor away from other possible income-earning activities or even just rest and relaxation. But as one of my major marketing platforms, it would behoove me to get this thing done on schedule, as I have a growing reputation to uphold in podcasting, consulting, and coaching, and missing deadlines is a sure sign that I'm not very serious at what I'm trying to convey as an image. If you're a fan of more than a few podcasts, you will see the issue of consistency come up with podcasts that start out on a pretty solid schedule and then post episode updates sporadically if they don't just stop completely. In fact, most podcasts don't make it past episode 7, despite how frequently they're supposed to be produced. Since few podcasts generate real revenue, it's hard to put a priority on a loss leader that continues to rack up losses, especially when there are so many other things, top priority or not, that a person could be doing. For you, maybe you've put priority on your health and plan to get to the gym more often. This is important to you, But unless you actually put a deadline on a particular task at the gym, such as mastering a circuit for training or putting in so many miles on a treadmill, you'll be distracted by so many other activities, many with real deadlines and real consequences. You'll never get to the gym. There will always be a report due or some housework to do that will seem like a more practical use of your time, since going to the gym doesn't have the consequence of getting you on the wrong side of things with your boss or your spouse. Now, we opened up the lesson with a promise of giving some tips to help you with your hitting of deadlines, and so it's time we delivered on that promise. Tip number 1 is to find a way to care about the deadline. You have to start out with not being lax about deadlines. Even if there is no serious consequences to missing the deadline and no one seems to need to put a priority on your deadlines, you need to make them a priority anyway. Make broken deadlines akin to a personal sin against yourself, and you will always find a way to get the jobs done on time. Tip number 2 is to keep a list of projects with their deadlines and keep that list close. Now that you care about your deadlines, you should care enough to keep your projects organized and their deadlines documented. Having projects with deadlines listed in one place makes it easy for you to check often to make sure you know what's due and when. It will also be easy to check off the deadlines done, which leads to tip number 3. Make a game out of it. Your project list becomes a de facto scorecard as you find yourself checking off the completed projects before their deadlines. And the more projects you can check off ahead of schedule, the more points you can score for yourself. Tip number 4 asks you to communicate to assure a clear deadline. Keep any chance of fuzzy timekeeping from creeping up on you by discussing in clear detail with all parties what the actual deadline is and what the actual consequences are. Whether it's with bosses, clients, spouses, or children, if you open up with a clear discussion of what is expected and when, and handle the discussion with complete documentation, you are less likely to come up with an awkward ending as a deadline approaches. Tip number 5 is to work with a cushion. To get a clear idea of how long a project will take, break it down into smaller pieces. Then, for each piece, estimate how much time it will take to complete, and then add a cushion of time to that estimate. When you add up all your time estimates from all the pieces, you'll have a time cushion built in that will allow for delays and setbacks without jeopardizing the initial deadline. And finally, tip number 6 is probably the most important, and that's don't overcommit yourself. If you have the power to assign yourself work, do not take on more work than you can honestly handle. If you are a supervisor and can assign work to others, do not overload your employees even if they're asking for it. And if you're at the mercy of your supervisor, have a talk up front with that person about a healthy and sane workload that you should be able to handle. If they push more on you than you can handle and you find yourself struggling to hit your deadlines, you need to make a new personal deadline for yourself, and that's for how long it will take for you to move on to a new job. The word deadline works a lot like the word consequence, which I often have to remind people the word has no malicious intent to it. A consequence is just an outcome of an action, and a deadline is just a due date for a project or action. But a deadline paired with the proper priority and the right amount of positive and negative consequences should keep you motivated to get the jobs you need to get done, and on deadline. That puts a wrap on the main theme for this week. If you like the advice given, or me, the advisor that gave the advice, why don't you consider a more serious investment into your personal improvement journey for yourself and your business? If you're ready, we're ready. We're ready for one-on-one sessions with our peak performance advisors. This is regular coaching, both by phone and with some internet back and forth correspondence and homework, we like to say. And there's no long-term commitment necessary. In fact, if you talk to us now, your first initial talk with us will be absolutely free with no strings attached. For more information, just send us an email to ppadvisors, that is PPADVISORS @att.net. So I've given you this week's advice and I've asked you to make an upgrade. This is the point where I let you, the listeners, hold my feet to the fire on upcoming projects that my brain cooks up that sometimes my butt doesn't want to cash in. We're calling this segment Accountability on Me, and we're still calling it that because we hadn't found anything better to call it. And even if you've not paid any money into any of our projects, that is fine. Anyone listening to this podcast, whether it's the first time or a long time, has just as much right to comment as anyone else. So, the Accountability on Me segment lives, or at least for this episode. As we talked about in the last week, we're still reviewing just about everything inside this podcast to make sure it is viable to you, the listeners. But since I am still doing this segment, this week we're going to use it to promote a source for this podcast that I have been neglecting to promote, but have recently found to be a great source of pride. If you have an iPhone, Android device, WebOS phone, or a BlackBerry, you should check out Stitcher Smart Radio. A quick pitch will have me tell you that it's the home for your on-demand news, talk, and more on your mobile phone. The latest episodes of all your favorite podcasts will always be available to you with no syncing needed and no memory or storage wasted. You can download it easily today at Stitcher.com or check out your particular app store for the app. Okay, so now that is done, let me quickly state that Stitcher has become a personal lifesaver when I have wanted to listen to my latest episodes of my favorite podcasts, but didn't want to turn on my laptop and then sync the file to my MP3 player. And it's becoming a greater source of podcast downloads for the 10-Minute Life Coach. If you're having trouble downloading and syncing, getting this app may be a lifesaver for you as well. So for next week, check out Stitcher Smart Radio at Stitcher.com or, of course, by checking out your particular app store. Search for the 10-Minute Life Coach along with some of your other favorite podcasts, and away you go. As always, you're free to send me encouragement, ridicule, questions about my general sanity, whatever you like, via the comments on the website or via email directly to 10minutelifecoach@att.net. And that's a wrap for this week's program. I'm Jay Cleveland Payne, and thank you so much for listening to the 10-Minute Life Coaching Program. For more information on this show, visit its online home at 10minutelifecoach.com. Information on Peak Performance Advisors coaching, that is one-on-one coaching via the phone and some email back and forth, so a little homework back and forth, if you will. That's very simple. We're ready for you, and there's no long-term commitment involved. Email us at ppadvisors, ppadvisors @att.net. Next week on the 10-Minute Life Coach podcast, I'll present some more ideas and tips that help you get your business and your personal life in order for absolutely no monetary charge. All I'm asking of you is about 10 minutes of your time. Until then, I say again, thank you.